It was one of those mornings where everything felt perfectly in place. The sun was just high enough to pour light through the kitchen blinds, the coffee machine had done its job faithfully, and I had nowhere urgent to be for a few precious hours. I was in sweatpants, a t-shirt, and halfway through a second cup of dark roast when the knock came. And it wasn't a polite, neighborly knock, either. No, this was the kind of pounding that makes your stomach drop because it carries urgency, authority, and, let's be honest, a bit of unnecessary aggression. 3 sharp bangs, a pause, and then 2 more, louder this time, like someone trying to summon me to the door under threat of demolition. Now, as someone who's trained to read situations, I can usually tell the difference between a cop's knock, a salesperson's timid tap, and the impatient hammering of someone who believes the world owes them attention. This one was theatrical. It was designed to sound official but had a sort of overdone quality, the way a child slams a toy gavel while playing judge. Still, curiosity won out, and I set down my mug, rolled my shoulders back, and headed for the door. When I opened it, I was greeted by the sight of 2 men who looked like they had just walked off the set of a bad TV drama about neighborhood security. Both wore navy blue uniforms that didn't quite match, one had cargo pants, the other slacks that were a shade too light. Their shirts had iron-on patches with the words, "HOA Police," in block letters, the kind of thing you'd expect from a novelty store. One of them had a baseball cap with the same words embroidered on the front, only the stitching was crooked, like it had been done in a hurry or on the cheap. The other guy, the taller of the 2, sported a shiny badge clipped to his belt that I could tell immediately wasn't real. It was oversized, reflective in the wrong places, and had the unmistakable appearance of a plastic toy coated in metallic paint. The shorter man stepped forward first, puffing his chest like he was about to announce a drug bust. "Sir," he began, his voice pitched low in an attempt to sound commanding, "we're with the HOA Police. You're in violation of several neighborhood regulations, and we're here to take you in." I blinked, not because I was intimidated, but because the sheer audacity of the introduction short-circuited my brain for a solid 2 seconds. HOA Police. That was a new one. I had heard of overzealous homeowners associations trying to control things like mailbox color or how long you could leave holiday decorations up, but creating their own police force. That was next-level entitlement. Before I could respond, the taller man chimed in, nodding gravely. "We've had multiple complaints about your property. Trash cans left visible for more than 24 hours, improper lawn edging, and," he paused dramatically as if to deliver the killing blow, "curtains that don't comply with the neighborhood aesthetic guidelines." I stared at him, then at the other one, waiting for the punchline. Surely, this was a prank. Maybe one of my neighbors had decided to spice up a slow weekend by hiring actors. But the way they stood, arms crossed, feet planted wide, badges glinting in the sun, they were dead serious. "Gentlemen," I said slowly, careful not to let amusement creep too obviously into my voice, "are you telling me you're here to arrest me over curtains?" The shorter one straightened. "Sir, we don't make the rules. We enforce them, and in this community, rules matter. Now, you can either come with us peacefully, or we'll have to escalate this situation." Escalate. The word hung in the air like the plot twist of a bad sitcom. My FBI training kicked in, not because I felt threatened, but because something about the performance begged for closer observation. These 2 weren't random pranksters. They were committed, delusional, and clearly trying to project authority over me. Their uniforms, laughable as they were, had been put together with intent. Their tone, though exaggerated, had been rehearsed. They genuinely thought they could convince me to comply. I crossed my arms and leaned casually against the doorframe, feigning mild interest. "So let me get this straight. You're with, what did you call it? The HOA Police, and you think you have the authority to arrest me for trash cans and curtains?" The taller one scowled. "You can mock us all you want, sir, but we're here under the full authority of the Homeowners Association Board. They've empowered us to act when residents refuse to comply. You've been warned multiple times." I raised an eyebrow. "Warned? I don't recall seeing any notices." The shorter one smirked, pulling a crumpled piece of paper from his back pocket. It was a citation, printed on cheap copy paper with blurry clip art of a gavel at the top. My supposed violations were listed in bullet points, riddled with spelling errors. One line actually read, "Failure to keep lawn under control, $200 fine." Another claimed I had disrespected HOA authority. I almost laughed out loud, but instead I held the paper like it was evidence at a crime scene. Because, frankly, it was. This is your official documentation? I asked, glancing up at them. That's right, the shorter one said proudly. You can pay the fines, or you can come with us. Those are your choices. It was at that moment I realized they weren't just bluffing. They actually expected me to believe they had the power to arrest me. And maybe, just maybe, they'd already pulled this act on other neighbors who were too intimidated or too confused to push back. That thought sparked something deeper than amusement. It shifted the situation from funny to serious. But I didn't show my hand just yet. Instead, I let them stew in their own performance. Well, I said, folding the paper neatly and slipping it into my pocket, this is certainly unexpected. You boys must be busy if you're going door to door over curtains. Why don't you tell me exactly how this arrest process works? I've never been arrested by the HOA before. The taller one glanced at his partner, then back at me, clearly uncertain. Finally, he squared his shoulders and said, we escort you to the HOA office, where you'll be processed. If you resist, we have the authority to detain you. He tapped his belt meaningfully, and I noticed for the first time what looked like a pair of plastic handcuffs dangling from a carabiner. Not regulation cuffs, mind you, these were the kind you buy for $5 at a Halloween store. I nodded slowly, biting back a smile. Detain me, right. Inside, part of me was boiling at the sheer gall of it. The other part was quietly entertained. They had no idea who they were talking to. No idea that I'd spent years working with real law enforcement, training to spot liars, manipulators, and opportunists. No idea that the person they were trying to con into submission wasn't just a random homeowner, but an FBI agent who'd put away people with far more sophisticated scams than this. Still, I wasn't about to blow my cover just yet. Let them talk. Let them dig their hole deeper. After all, I had all morning, and something told me this was going to be far more entertaining than finishing my coffee. The two self-appointed enforcers didn't waste any time once they believed they had me hooked. With the citation paper already tucked into my pocket like a souvenir, the shorter man, who seemed to fancy himself the brains of the operation, cleared his throat and began rattling off my supposed crimes. He read them in a tone that was equal parts smug and rehearsed, as though he'd been practicing in front of a mirror for weeks. First violation, he announced, holding up a clipboard he had pulled from under his arm. You parked your vehicle incorrectly. Our regulations clearly state that all vehicles must be pulled in headfirst. Backing into your driveway is prohibited, as it disrupts the visual uniformity of the neighborhood. I tilted my head, biting down on the urge to laugh. Backing into a driveway, that was the crime. I pictured a courtroom scene in my head, 12 jurors solemnly debating the moral weight of reverse parking. It was absurd to the point of comedy, but I let my face remain neutral. Headfirst only, huh, I said, scratching my chin as if this were a serious legal matter. And here I thought driveways were designed for cars to go in either direction. Silly me. The taller one, clearly eager to maintain some form of intimidation, stepped forward with a scowl. Don't mock the rules. They're there for a reason. Oh, I'd love to hear that reason, I said, folding my arms. He hesitated, then blurted, it creates a safer environment for children playing outside. That was their angle. I nearly applauded the creativity. But before I could press, the shorter one continued, flipping to the next page on his clipboard like a prosecutor unveiling damning evidence. Second violation. Your trash cans. Our surveillance has recorded you leaving them out for more than 24 hours after collection day. Surveillance, I repeated. What are we talking about here? Hidden cameras? Drones? He ignored my jab and carried on. The HOA guidelines are clear. Trash receptacles must be stored out of sight by 6 p.m. on the day of pickup. Yours were visible until 10:30 a.m. the following morning. That's a direct violation. I couldn't help myself, I chuckled. So I'm under arrest for oversleeping on garbage day. The taller one narrowed his eyes. You think this is a joke? These rules are serious. They maintain the order and beauty of this community. Order and beauty, over trash cans. The sheer irony was that, at that very moment, I could glance past their shoulders and see Mrs. Patterson's overflowing recycling bin tipped halfway into the street. If they were so concerned about order, they were barking up the wrong tree. But the pièce de résistance came when the shorter man delivered the third charge. He lowered his voice as though he were about to expose a scandal worthy of national news. Third violation. Your curtains. I blinked. My curtains. That's correct, he said, flipping his clipboard around to show me a grainy photo clearly printed on a home inkjet printer. From the angle, I could tell it had been taken from the sidewalk in front of my house, zoomed in poorly, with the blinds half shut. The photo captured just enough of the curtains in my living room to show that they were dark gray instead of the required off-white. "You are in violation of aesthetic uniformity," he said, his voice dripping with triumph. "The neighborhood guidelines clearly state that all front-facing window treatments must be in approved neutral shades. Yours are not. Therefore, you are non-compliant and subject to fines and enforcement." I took the photo from him and studied it, feigning seriousness. "So let me get this straight. You were standing outside my home, photographing my windows, because of curtains." The taller man crossed his arms and nodded. "We document everything. We have the authority to do so." "Oh, I see," I said, nodding back slowly. Authority. The word rolled around in my head like a marble in a tin cup. They kept using it, but it was flimsy, propped up by paper-thin confidence and cheap uniforms. What fascinated me was how deeply they believed in the performance. This wasn't just about money, it was about power. They wanted to play cop in a world that never gave them a badge, and the HOA was their stage. The shorter man slapped the clipboard shut. "These repeated offenses have left us no choice. We're authorized to escalate. This means you're coming with us. Refusal will result in additional penalties, and we're fully prepared to detain you right here." He gestured to his partner, who patted the plastic handcuffs like a cowboy showing off his holster. I almost broke character right there. They honestly thought they could drag me down the street in toy cuffs and process me in some kangaroo court. Instead, I leaned against the doorframe again, tilting my head with curiosity. "Interesting. So tell me, what exactly does the processing involve? Do you have a holding cell next to the clubhouse pool? A booking officer stationed at the tennis courts?" The taller one bristled. "We're not here to amuse you. We're here to enforce the rules. You've ignored notices, you've piled up violations, and now it's time to face the consequences." Notices. That word caught my attention. If they'd really been sending out fake citations, that meant they weren't just targeting me. They'd probably blanketed the neighborhood with bogus paperwork, hoping some residents would panic and pay up. The crumpled ticket in my pocket wasn't just sloppy, it was evidence of a larger scam. And that, more than anything, made me decide to play along a little longer. I straightened, nodding as though I were finally taking them seriously. "Okay, let's say I come with you. What happens next?" The shorter one smirked, clearly thinking he'd won. "You'll appear before the board. They'll decide your punishment, usually fines, possibly suspension of privileges." "Privileges," I echoed. "Access to community amenities," he said matter-of-factly. "Pool, clubhouse, gym. You'll be banned until you pay what you owe. And if you continue to resist, you could face permanent expulsion from the community." Expulsion. From my own home. The sheer entitlement of the statement nearly bowled me over. Here were two men, in mismatched uniforms, holding a clipboard full of typos, threatening to exile me from the very house I owned because my curtains didn't match their preferred shade of beige. But instead of calling them out, I smiled faintly and nodded. "Well, gentlemen, you've certainly given me a lot to think about. Why don't we go over those charges one more time, just so I'm absolutely clear?" The taller one grunted impatiently, but the shorter man relished the opportunity. He repeated each violation with gusto, savoring the words as though he were lecturing a classroom. I let him finish, nodding along, memorizing every detail. Because while they thought they were building a case against me, I was building one against them. And unlike their flimsy authority, mine was very, very real. As the performance dragged on, I could tell they were running out of steam. The shorter one had delivered his laundry list of my supposed violations with all the smugness of a traffic cop on a power trip, but now he was looking at me expectantly, waiting for me to crack, to argue, or to beg. The taller one, meanwhile, was trying his hardest to play the role of silent muscle, arms crossed, jaw set, posture stiff. But there was a nervous twitch in his left hand, a small, involuntary fidget that told me he wasn't as confident as he wanted to appear. I let the silence hang just long enough for them to squirm. Then I tilted my head and asked casually, "So, out of curiosity, how long have you two been doing this?" The shorter one perked up immediately. "We've been operating in this neighborhood for years. The HOA has always relied on us to enforce the rules." "Is that right?" I said, nodding thoughtfully. "So you're officially hired by the HOA board?" He opened his mouth to say yes, but before he could answer, the taller one cut in. Actually, I'm not HOA. I'm ex-law enforcement, 10 years on the force. I know how this works. The HOA brought me in for my expertise. That caught my attention. The contradiction was immediate and glaring, but they didn't seem to notice. The shorter one shot his partner a sharp look, clearly annoyed, but recovered quickly. Yes, well, we represent both the HOA and the broader law enforcement community. That's what gives us authority. I couldn't resist a small smile. Both, huh, that's impressive. Must be a tricky balance, working under an HOA board and the government at the same time. The taller man nodded gravely, as though I had just made a profound observation. Exactly, it's a lot of responsibility. But I take it seriously. The cracks were widening, and I knew if I pressed even a little harder, their stories would unravel completely. Still, I kept my tone mild, conversational, like I was simply curious. You know, I have a bit of a law enforcement background myself. Maybe you could show me your credentials, just so I understand how it all works. The shorter one stiffened immediately. Our identification isn't for public viewing. HOA regulations protect our anonymity. Anonymity, I repeated, pretending to mull it over. That's interesting. Usually, law enforcement officers are required to identify themselves when acting in an official capacity. The taller man bristled. I told you, I'm ex-law enforcement. I don't need to prove anything. That was the first real flare of temper, and it told me everything I needed to know. When people are bluffing, they hate being asked for proof. They'll dodge, deflect, or lash out, anything but provide actual evidence. And sure enough, instead of showing me anything official, the taller man reached down and tapped the shiny badge clipped to his belt. Here, he said, this is all the proof you need. I looked down at the badge, letting my eyes linger as if I were impressed. In reality, I was fighting hard not to laugh. It was the kind of badge you'd find in a child's playset, plastic molded into a generic star shape, with a cheap metallic paint finish. To make matters worse, someone had clearly stuck a printed sticker over the center, where it proudly read, HOA Police, in blocky, uneven letters. The sticker was peeling slightly at the edges. If this man had really spent 10 years on any police force, I was the Queen of England. That's quite a badge, I said diplomatically. Mind if I take a closer look? He pulled back immediately, his hand snapping to cover it. That's not necessary. The shorter one jumped in again, clearly sensing the situation was slipping. Look, the important thing is that we're here now. The rules are the rules. Homeowners, like you need to understand that compliance isn't optional. You don't get to decide which regulations you follow. You follow them all, or you face consequences. His words carried the sharp edge of entitlement, the kind that comes from people who crave authority but have never truly earned it. It was the same tone I'd heard from petty tyrants in every corner of society, people who believed their personal opinions should be law, and who invented systems to force others into submission. I studied him for a moment. He believed every word he was saying. This wasn't just about a scam for money. It was about control. They'd convinced themselves they had the right to dictate every trivial detail of their neighbors' lives. The trash cans, the parking, the curtains, it wasn't about maintaining order. It was about enforcing obedience. So let me get this straight, I said finally. If the HOA decides tomorrow that everyone has to mow their lawn in diagonal stripes instead of straight lines, you'd be out here issuing citations for noncompliance. Exactly, he said without hesitation. That's how order works. Without rules, there's chaos. I leaned back against the doorframe, letting out a slow breath. And you two are the guardians of that order. The taller one nodded firmly. That's right, we make sure everyone knows their place. That was the moment I stopped wondering if this was just a neighborhood prank. These men weren't joking. They weren't improvising. They had built an entire fantasy world where they were the ultimate arbiters of right and wrong. And in their minds, anyone who questioned them was a threat to be neutralized. I let the thought settle for a beat, then shifted gears. You mentioned being ex-law enforcement. Where exactly did you serve? The taller one hesitated. City police. Which city? I pressed. He frowned. Downtown. Downtown, I repeated slowly. That's not a city. That's a direction. His partner shot him another angry look, and for the first time, I saw panic flicker in his eyes. He was slipping, and he knew it. The silence stretched, heavy and awkward, until the shorter one blurted out, "It doesn't matter where he served. The point is, we have the power now. The HOA gave us that power, and you have to respect it." Respect. That was what they wanted more than anything. Not money, not even control, just respect. The illusion of being taken seriously. I straightened, letting my casual demeanor shift just slightly, enough to make them uneasy. Well, gentlemen, I appreciate the clarification. But you should know something important. They both froze, watching me closely. I've dealt with law enforcement before, I said evenly. Real law enforcement, and I have a very good sense of when someone's telling me the truth, and when they're making it up as they go along. The taller man swallowed hard, his confidence faltering. The shorter one opened his mouth to protest, but I raised a hand to cut him off. You've worked hard on this little act, I continued, my voice calm but firm. But your stories don't match. Your credentials are laughable, and the more you talk, the more obvious it becomes that you're making up rules as you go. Their faces paled. For the first time, I saw genuine uncertainty in their eyes. They had counted on intimidation, on neighbors being too flustered or embarrassed to push back. They hadn't expected someone to stand there calmly, dissecting their lies piece by piece. And as I watched them flounder, I knew they were one step away from collapse. All it would take was the right push. The silence between us stretched until it became almost unbearable. The shorter man shifted on his feet, his earlier bravado beginning to wilt under the weight of my steady stare. The taller one clenched his jaw, clearly struggling to maintain the hard exterior he had been projecting, but the twitch in his hand had become more pronounced, and his eyes darted between me and the street as if calculating his exit strategy. I let them stew for another long moment. In my line of work, silence is often more effective than interrogation. People reveal their true selves when they're forced to fill the void. And sure enough, the shorter man broke first. Look, he said, his voice a little too loud, you don't have to make this harder than it is. If you just cooperate, we can make this all go away. Pay the fines, change the curtains, park your car properly, and no one has to know you resisted WA authority. That last phrase, resisted WA authority, nearly broke me. It sounded like something ripped straight from a bad dystopian novel. But I kept my face neutral, almost bored, as if I were listening to a child explaining playground rules. Here's the thing, I said slowly, folding my arms across my chest. You've made a lot of claims. You've tried very hard to sell me on your authority. But the more you talk, the more obvious it becomes that you have no real power here. The taller one snapped back quickly, defensive. We already told you, we're empowered by the WA board. We're the enforcers. If you don't comply, you'll regret it. I tilted my head. Funny you should say that. Because here's something you didn't consider. I'm not just some random homeowner you can intimidate with fake citations and plastic badges. Their eyes narrowed in unison, suspicion and unease flickering across their faces. I straightened, letting the calm confidence in my voice cut through their bluster. I'm a federal agent, FBI. The words landed like a thunderclap. For the first time since they had shown up, both men lost the script. The shorter one's jaw dropped slightly, his lips parting as though he wanted to argue but couldn't find the words. The taller one blinked, his face twitching as the weight of what I'd said registered. That's right, I continued, reaching casually into my back pocket. Unlike you two, I actually have credentials worth showing. I pulled out my leather badge case, flipped it open, and held it up just long enough for both of them to see the unmistakable seal and identification inside. The reaction was immediate. The taller man's bravado cracked like glass, his shoulders sagged, and the color drained from his face. The shorter one visibly swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing as his eyes darted from my credentials to his partner, as though silently begging for guidance. This, I said, gesturing with the badge, is real. Issued by the United States government. Backed by federal law. The difference between me and you is that I don't have to pretend. Neither of them spoke. The street was quiet, save for the distant hum of a lawnmower somewhere down the block. For the first time since they arrived, I had absolute silence, not because they wanted me to fill it, but because they had nothing left to say. I took a step closer, lowering my voice so it carried a sharper edge. Do you two have any idea what kind of trouble you're in right now? Impersonating law enforcement is a federal crime. Do you understand what that means? The shorter one stammered. We're not impersonating, we're WA, it's not the same. Oh, it's exactly the same, I cut him off. You showed up at my door in uniforms designed to mimic police. You carried fake badges, issued fake citations, and threatened me with arrest. That's impersonation. That's fraud. That's attempted extortion. Each one of those is a serious charge, and you've just racked up the whole set in less than 30 minutes. The taller one's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. We didn't mean, this is just what? I snapped, stepping forward so quickly they both flinched. A joke? You think intimidating your neighbors is funny? Or maybe you thought nobody here would know better, that you could bully people into handing over money and bending to your little fantasy of authority? Neither answered. Their silence was confirmation enough. I let the weight of my words hang for a moment before continuing, my voice lower but deadlier. I could call this in right now. Have a patrol car here in 10 minutes. You'd be in handcuffs, real handcuffs, not those plastic toys on your belt, and booked for felony impersonation before lunchtime. You'd spend the night in a holding cell, explaining to real officers why you thought it was a good idea to play dress up as police. The shorter one's face had gone pale, beads of sweat forming along his hairline. His earlier arrogance had evaporated, replaced by the unmistakable panic of someone who realizes the game is up. The taller man finally found his voice, though it cracked when he spoke. Listen, we weren't trying to hurt anyone. We just wanted people to take the rules seriously. I gave him a long, withering look. No, you wanted power, you wanted control, and you thought you could get it by pretending to be something you're not. That's not about rules, that's about ego. For a moment, none of us moved. The two of them stood frozen, caught between running and begging, while I kept my stance firm, my badge still visible at my side. Then, slowly, I closed the case and slipped it back into my pocket. Here's what's going to happen, I said, my voice calm but unyielding. You're going to turn around, walk off this property, and never pull this stunt again. Because if I see either of you, or anyone else dressed like you, knocking on doors with fake citations, I won't be so generous next time. I'll make that call, and you'll be explaining yourselves to federal prosecutors instead of me. The shorter man nodded quickly, his head bobbing like a puppet on strings. The taller one hesitated, his pride clearly wrestling with his fear, but in the end he gave a stiff, jerky nod. Good, I said, straightening. Now go. They didn't need to be told twice. Without another word, they turned and started down the driveway, their pace quickening with each step until it was almost a jog. I watched them until they disappeared around the corner, my jaw set, my pulse steady. Only then did I let out a slow breath. The situation had turned on a dime, from them believing they held the power, to realizing they'd picked the absolute worst person in the neighborhood to mess with. And though I hadn't called it in yet, I knew the story wasn't over. People like that didn't just stop because they were embarrassed once. They'd either try again with someone else, or they'd already tried before. Which meant it was only a matter of time before their little operation came fully into the light. As I turned back into the house, I couldn't help but shake my head. Curtains, trash cans, parking, such petty excuses for such reckless behavior. And yet, entitlement had driven them to gamble with federal crimes. They had wanted to play cops and control their neighbors. Instead, they had just stared down the wrong badge. After they scurried away down my driveway, I stood there for a long moment, the faint echo of their retreating footsteps hanging in the air. I knew men like that didn't just vanish quietly. Their egos wouldn't allow it. They might lick their wounds, but sooner or later they'd circle back, either at my house or someone else's. And that was the part one couldn't let slide. It wasn't just about their laughable attempt to intimidate me, it was about the fact that they'd almost certainly already shaken down some of my neighbors. Maybe an elderly couple too polite to question their fake authority, or a young family too busy to risk conflict. The thought gnawed at me. My neighbors deserved better than to live under the thumb of a counterfeit police force. I went back inside, pulled out my phone, and called a contact at the local precinct. I didn't need the full weight of the bureau for this, not yet. What I needed was backup from the people who would actually handle the arrest and booking. When the dispatcher picked up, I explained the situation in measured, professional detail: 2 individuals impersonating law enforcement, conducting door-to-door intimidation, issuing fraudulent citations, and attempting extortion. The dispatcher's tone shifted instantly from casual to serious. "Stay put," she said. "We'll send a unit." Good. I stayed by the window, sipping the coffee that had long since gone lukewarm, and sure enough, I spotted the 2 impostors not 10 minutes later. They hadn't left the neighborhood. Instead, they were 2 streets over, parked at the curb in a beat-up sedan that had magnetic decals slapped onto the doors, once again reading, "WA Police," in block letters. The decals were so poorly printed that one corner was already peeling away in the breeze. I watched as they marched up to another house, clipboards in hand, and knocked hard on the door. Even from a distance, I could see their postures, stiff, aggressive, all puffed up authority. The door opened, and I recognized the homeowner immediately, Mrs. Delgado, a widow in her 70s who lived alone. My chest tightened. She was the perfect target for men like them, polite, trusting, unlikely to argue with anyone claiming official power. I could almost hear their rehearsed lines from where I stood. Trash cans, curtains, parking, whatever excuse they could manufacture to frighten her into handing over cash. I didn't wait. I stepped outside, phone in hand, and called the officer back. "They're at another house now," I said, my voice clipped. "Elderly resident. They're trying it again." The officer assured me units were already en route, and I gave them the address. Now it was just a matter of time. The impostors must have sensed something was off, because their act was far sloppier than it had been with me. Mrs. Delgado stood in her doorway clutching a slip of paper they'd shoved at her, her face uncertain and worried. One of the men gestured sharply toward her driveway, while the other leaned in far too close, waving his clipboard like it was a warrant. I started walking down the street, closing the distance slowly, keeping my eyes on them. My presence alone was enough to rattle them. The taller one noticed me first, his face tightening as recognition dawned. He nudged his partner, and they both stiffened like cornered animals. I stopped at the edge of Mrs. Delgado's yard. "Ma'am," I called out evenly, "you don't need to listen to these men. They're not who they say they are." The shorter one spun around, his face flushing. "Stay out of this. We're handling official HOA business." I took another step forward, my tone calm but authoritative. Official business doesn't involve intimidation, fraudulent documents, or impersonating law enforcement. And it certainly doesn't involve threatening a 70-year-old woman over imaginary violations. They faltered, caught between doubling down and cutting their losses. And that's when the faint wail of sirens floated down the street. The sound was distant at first, then grew sharper, louder, undeniable. Panic flickered across their faces, and I knew the facade was about to collapse completely. The taller one muttered something to his partner, and they both bolted for their car. Mrs. Delgado gasped, still clutching the paper in her hands. I moved quickly, intercepting their path just long enough to slow them down. "You really want to add resisting arrest to your list of charges?" I asked, my voice steady. They didn't answer, they just shoved past, fumbling with their keys as they scrambled into the car. The engine roared to life, and for a moment it looked like they might actually try to make a run for it. But the sirens were close now, so close I could see the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the houses at the end of the street. 2 patrol cars rounded the corner, engines humming, tires crunching against the pavement as they pulled in fast and angled to block the sedan's path. The impostors froze, trapped. Doors slammed, and officers spilled out, weapons holstered but hands firm on their belts. "Step out of the vehicle," one of them barked. "Hands where we can see them." The taller man hesitated, gripping the wheel, but his partner was already unraveling. The shorter one's hands shot up, trembling as he stammered, "We didn't mean, this isn't." "Out of the car, now." Reluctantly, both men complied, stepping out with their hands raised. The officers moved quickly, cuffing them with real steel handcuffs that clicked shut with a finality their cheap plastic toys could never imitate. The taller man tried to protest, sputtering about, "HOA authority," but the officers weren't having it. One of them snatched the clipboard from his hands, flipping through the papers with a look of disgust. "This is garbage," the officer muttered. "Fake documents, fake badges, you two are in serious trouble." I stepped forward then, flashing my credentials just long enough to establish who I was and why I'd called this in. The lead officer's eyes widened slightly, and he gave me a nod of respect. "Appreciate the heads up," he said. "Looks like they've been running a scam around here for a while." I glanced at Mrs. Delgado, who was still standing in her doorway, visibly shaken. I gave her a reassuring smile. "You're safe now, ma'am. They won't be bothering you again." She nodded gratefully, clutching the fraudulent citation in her hand like proof of a nightmare she was finally waking from. "Thank you," she whispered. By then, neighbors had begun to gather. Curious faces peeked out from windows, doors opened, and soon a small crowd had formed on the sidewalk. Whispers rippled through them as they recognized the so-called HOA police being loaded into the back of real patrol cars. Relief, amusement, and indignation mingled in the air. Some neighbors laughed outright, shaking their heads at the absurdity of it all. Others muttered angrily, wondering how long these two had been pulling their stunt unchecked. "They came to our house last week," one man said, stepping forward. Tried to fine us for leaving a garden hose out. My wife almost paid them. Same here, another neighbor added. Said our front porch light was the wrong wattage. The stories tumbled out one after another, each more ridiculous than the last. The scope of the scam was clear now. They had been making the rounds, preying on anyone who was too polite, too busy, or too intimidated to push back. And judging by the stack of fake citations the officers were collecting from their car, they had been at it for weeks, maybe months. I looked around at the crowd, my neighbors, people I'd waved to in passing but rarely spoken to at length. They all wore the same expression now, a mix of anger and relief. Anger at having been deceived, but relief that someone had finally put a stop to it. One of the officers closed the cruiser door with a heavy thud and turned to the group. These two are going to be facing charges for impersonating law enforcement, attempted fraud, and harassment. If any of you received fake tickets or paid money to them, please come down to the station to file a report. There were murmurs of agreement, nods all around. A few neighbors clapped me on the shoulder, thanking me for stepping in. I accepted their gratitude with a polite smile, but inside I felt something deeper, satisfaction. Not for the recognition, but for the fact that justice had been served. The impostors had tried to create their own little empire of fear and control, and now they were headed exactly where they belonged, into the custody of real officers, under real laws. As the cruisers pulled away, lights flashing, I stood in the street with my neighbors, watching until they disappeared down the block. The air felt lighter somehow, the weight of their scam lifted off the neighborhood. For the first time all day, I allowed myself a real smile. They had come knocking at the wrong door, and now, thanks to a little patience, a little timing, and a real badge, their entitled fantasy had come crashing down. The cruisers had barely disappeared around the corner when the neighborhood seemed to exhale all at once. The cluster of residents who had gathered slowly dispersed, drifting back toward their porches and driveways, buzzing with conversation. I could hear fragments of their words, outrage over the fake tickets, relief that someone had finally caught the imposters, and laughter at just how ridiculous the whole HOA police idea really was. A few lingered, still shaken but grateful. Mrs. Delgado, bless her, thanked me again before retreating inside, clutching that fraudulent citation as though it were proof of a battle she had narrowly survived. Later that evening, I received confirmation from the precinct. Both men were in custody, booked on multiple charges. Impersonating law enforcement, attempted fraud, harassment, even trespassing. They hadn't just made a fool of themselves at my door, they'd committed real crimes, and now the law was going to treat them accordingly. I felt a deep satisfaction at that. It wasn't about revenge, it was about restoring balance. Neighborhoods thrive on trust, and those two had shattered it with their phony uniforms and plastic badges. The next day, the real HOA board issued a statement. It was slid into mailboxes and posted on the community website in bold, defensive font. They made it clear, almost comically clear, that they had nothing to do with the so-called HOA police. The Homeowners Association does not and has never employed an enforcement agency, it read. We deeply regret any distress caused by individuals falsely claiming to represent us. The tone reeked of embarrassment. I imagined the board members sitting around a conference table, horrified that anyone might think they were foolish enough to hire wannabe cops to patrol the neighborhood. For once, the HOA and I agreed on something. Those two were an absolute disgrace. In the days that followed, stories poured out. Neighbors came forward one by one with their experiences. Some had been handed citations demanding hundreds of dollars for minor or invented violations. Others had been threatened with community expulsion, as though these two clowns had the authority to banish people from their own homes. A few admitted, sheepishly, that they had actually paid up. The impostors had banked on fear and intimidation, and for a while, it had worked. That, more than anything, fueled my determination to see the case through. It wasn't just a prank gone too far, it was exploitation, preying on good people who didn't know how to push back. When I spoke to the investigating officers later, I learned more about the duo's history. They weren't strangers to trouble. Both had a string of minor offenses, petty theft, disorderly conduct, even a few restraining orders from past neighbors. It seemed they had graduated from small-time nonsense to a more elaborate scam, probably believing they'd finally found a system they could manipulate. A homeowners association, with its maze of rules and fines, was the perfect camouflage for their con. They must have thought, who would question it? After all, HOAs are notorious for nitpicking, for sending stern letters about grass length or mailbox paint. Slip in a fake police force, and a clipboard full of bogus citations, and maybe most residents wouldn't think twice. But entitlement and greed have a way of making people sloppy. They couldn't resist overplaying their hand, claiming the power to arrest, threatening to haul people off for curtain colors, inventing ridiculous charges that no legitimate law would dare enforce. And that was their downfall. Their need for authority was so inflated, so desperate, that they tipped from scam artists into caricatures. I reflected on that a lot in the days after. Entitlement is a strange beast. It convinces people that rules don't just apply to others, but that they themselves should create the rules. That's what those two had wanted all along, not just money, but power. The power to knock on a stranger's door and dictate how they should live, dress, decorate, and behave. It was less about fines and more about feeding their own fragile egos. I'd seen versions of that before, in bigger, uglier forms during my FBI career, people who built elaborate schemes not just to get rich, but to control. Control is intoxicating, and for these two, pretending to be HOA police was their twisted shot at authority. The neighborhood, meanwhile, took the whole ordeal with surprising humor once the shock wore off. At the next community gathering, jokes flew around faster than the appetizers. Someone brought a toy badge from a dollar store and set it on the refreshment table. Another neighbor quipped about forming a lawn gnome enforcement squad, promising steep fines for anyone whose yard decor wasn't up to par. Laughter rippled through the group, the shared absurdity knitting people together in a way I hadn't seen before. For once, the HOA wasn't the enemy, those two fraudsters were. And mocking them was therapeutic. As for me, I couldn't help but smile at the irony. Out of all the houses they could have targeted, they'd picked mine, the one homeowner with a real badge, a real authority, and zero tolerance for nonsense. It was almost poetic. They had strutted up to my door, puffed out their chests, and tried to play police. Instead, they'd walked straight into a trap of their own making. Eventually, word spread beyond our neighborhood. Local news picked up the story, and for a week or so, we were the punchline of late-night jokes. Headlines blared, "Fake HOA police busted by real FBI agent." Reporters couldn't get enough of the contrast, the ludicrousness of two entitled fraudsters versus the sheer bad luck of targeting someone who actually worked in federal law enforcement. My phone buzzed with calls from colleagues, some laughing, others incredulous. More than one of them teased me, "Only you would end up collaring criminals on your own front porch." And maybe they were right. Maybe it was fate, or dumb luck, or just one of those cosmic jokes the universe likes to play. But whatever it was, it ended with justice. Those two imposters were facing real charges, ones that carried real consequences. No more clipboards, no more fake badges, no more strutting around pretending to be kings of the cul-de-sac. I'd like to think they learned their lesson, though I've been in this line of work long enough to know better. People like that rarely change. Entitlement digs deep, and when it's paired with greed, it finds new outlets. But at least for now, they were out of circulation, and my neighborhood could breathe easier. One evening, as I sat on my porch with a fresh cup of coffee, I caught myself chuckling. I thought about their little operation, their peeling decals, their crumpled tickets with spelling errors, their toy handcuffs dangling like props from a bad play. All that effort, all that bluster, just to end up in the back of a cruiser. I took a sip of coffee, leaned back, and shook my head. Next time, I muttered to myself, maybe they'll stick to lemonade stands instead of fake police forces. And with that, I finally let the chapter close. The knock came just after dusk, sharp and deliberate, the kind of knock that carried with it a sense of authority. Years on the force had trained me to read the small cues others overlooked, and that sound wasn't the careless rap of a neighbor borrowing sugar, nor the hesitant tap of a kid selling fundraiser cookies. It was firm, calculated, practiced, meant to be heard as official. I set down my coffee, instinctively straightening my posture as though preparing for an interview, and opened the door. On my porch stood two men dressed in dark uniforms, the kind you'd expect from law enforcement, though something about them didn't quite sit right. Their badges glinted under the porch light, but the metal looked too polished, too flat, lacking the weathered authenticity of the real thing. Each wore a black cap pulled low, and the younger of the two had a duty belt, so sparse it looked more like a Halloween costume accessory than actual police gear. "Good evening, sir," the older one said, his voice carrying the clipped rhythm of someone trying to sound official but overshooting into performance. "We're here on behalf of the Homeowners Association. You've been issued a warrant." He handed me a folded sheet of paper with a triumphant little smirk, like he expected me to gasp or recoil. Instead, I let the silence hang in the air as I unfolded it. The document was a mess. Words misspelled, no court header, no signature from a judge, just the HOA's name typed across the top in bold letters. At the bottom, a scrawled signature that looked suspiciously like Harold Jennings, though he'd clearly tried to disguise it with unnecessary flourishes. I let my eyes linger on the page before lifting them slowly to meet the impostor's gaze. His partner shifted uneasily, as though he already knew the act was falling apart. "You're here to serve a warrant," I repeated, my tone even, almost casual. "And this is supposed to be it." I waved the paper gently between two fingers. "Yes, sir," the older one pressed, though I caught the flicker of doubt in his eyes. "Failure to comply will result in your immediate arrest." That word, arrest, landed with the subtlety of a brick. Not detain, not citation, not even appearance notice. Arrest. It was the kind of terminology someone uses when they've watched too many cop dramas and decided they could mimic the role without understanding the script. I decided to play along, at least for the moment. "Interesting," I said, leaning against the doorframe. "Tell me, gentlemen, what agency are you with?" The younger one piped up too quickly. "Neighborhood Enforcement Division." The words came out in a rush, and he immediately glanced at his partner, as though searching for approval. The older man stiffened but didn't correct him. "Neighborhood Enforcement Division," I repeated, tasting the absurdity of it. I let the silence stretch again, my eyes drifting to their vehicle parked by the curb. It wasn't marked, not even with magnetic decals. Just a gray minivan, the kind soccer moms drive, only this one had mismatched hubcaps and a dent in the rear bumper. The thought of them pulling up in that and expecting to look intimidating almost made me laugh out loud. "All right," I said finally, lowering my voice to something firmer, more commanding. "Why don't you show me your credentials?" The older one reached for his badge, holding it up briefly before tucking it away again like a magician trying to distract from a botched trick. I caught the edges. No department seal, no serial number, not even the correct shape. A child with a 3D printer could have done better. The younger one didn't even bother pretending, he simply stood frozen, hands awkwardly at his sides. I said, letting my tone flatten. "So here's what we're going to do. You're going to explain exactly why you're standing on my porch with fake badges and a forged warrant, and then maybe, just maybe, I'll consider not putting you in cuffs right now." The color drained from the younger man's face. The older one, however, doubled down, puffing his chest as though bluffing his way forward could salvage the situation. "Sir, I advise you to cooperate. Non-compliance could escalate matters further." That was it, the final tell. Real officers never talk like that. We don't deal in vague threats, we specify charges, outline rights, state procedures. The more he spoke, the more he exposed himself. My training told me to de-escalate, but another part of me, the weary homeowner sick of HOA games, wanted to push him, to let him unravel completely under the weight of his own performance. "Escalate," I said softly, almost whispering, the way you do when you want someone to lean in and realize just how badly they've miscalculated. "Gentlemen, do you have any idea whose door you've knocked on?" The younger one blinked rapidly. The older one faltered for half a second, then steadied himself. "We're here to enforce HOA policy. Your position doesn't exempt you." That was when I smiled. Not broadly, not with humor, but with the kind of smile that says the game is over and the other side just hasn't realized it yet. "You're absolutely right," I said. "No one is above the law, which is why impersonating an officer, presenting a falsified warrant, and attempting an unlawful arrest are all felonies." I stepped forward, closing the distance between us, and lowered my voice another notch. "And you just committed them on the chief of police." The silence that followed was delicious. The younger man's mouth fell open, then shut, then opened again without sound. The older one clenched his jaw, but the sweat beating along his hairline betrayed him. I could almost see the gears grinding in their heads, trying to calculate the fastest way out of a trap they'd walked into blind. I didn't give them the chance. With one hand, I reached into my pocket, not for my weapon, but for my phone. "Here's what's going to happen," I said. "I'm calling dispatch. You're going to stand right here until real officers arrive. If either of you even thinks about walking away, I'll make sure you don't get far." The older one's bravado cracked just enough for his partner to see it, and once the younger man realized their act was finished, panic spread like wildfire. His eyes darted to the minivan, his legs shifting as though preparing to bolt. But one sharp glance from me froze him again. Years of command presence aren't something you learn in a weekend, you earn it over a career, and in that moment, every ounce of it radiated from me. And yet, even as I dialed dispatch, even as the reality of their situation settled on them like a weight, a single question burned in my mind: who had sent them? These two weren't masterminds. They were pawns, desperate or foolish enough to put on fake uniforms and knock on a cop's door. Pawns don't invent schemes like this. Pawns get sent, which meant behind them, hidden in the shadows of this farce, the HOA had decided to escalate its feud to a new and dangerous level. As I waited for dispatch to answer, I studied the impostors closely, noting every nervous twitch, every desperate glance. Whatever happened next, this confrontation was just the beginning. The HOA thought they could scare me into submission. Instead, they had handed me the evidence I needed, and the perfect excuse to tear their little empire apart.